Well, thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, and I want to thank you and Co-Chair Grassley for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for your work and for your testimony. Um, I want to start with a question to you, Director McDaniel, and Senator Grassley covered some of this, and there may be some overlap here as we've come in and out, so my apologies if I'm asking you all to be repetitive, but I come from New Hampshire, which has been very, very hard hit by the fentanyl epidemic in particular. But in my state and all across the country, we are seeing a rise in counterfeit pills that are laced with illicit drugs, and they're almost indistinguishable from legitimate medication. Last fall, I urged the DEA to take further action to address the danger of counterfeit pills. Consumers may think they are buying real medicine, but often wind up with fake pills laced with fentanyl or now methamphetamines. In 2021, the DEA seized over 20 million counterfeit pills, many of which contained a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. How is HIDA helping federal, state, and local law enforcement tackle the developing threat of counterfeit pills?
First of all, I agree with you. I cannot personally tell the difference between counterfeit and real, and our investigators can't either. And we are actually, the HIDA program, especially up in your area up there in New Hampshire, they've done, you had law enforcement coming in and going, guys, we can't continue to do the same thing over and over, and we have to actually do something different. And it was the chief of police sitting there with federal people in your state, and they were actually saying, we got to think out of the box. And they actually developed strategies that were more of, we're working with treatment and prevention more than we ever have.
Yeah.
And I would say in all my years of law enforcement, I never thought I'd say this, but I definitely say we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And it's through innovative strategies that were developed up in New England HIDA in your area, and New York, New Jersey HIDA, that is actually called the overdose response, that has gone, ONDCP has sent it out nationwide. It's part of all the HIDAs now, and I'm really happy about what it's doing.
Well, I appreciate that, and I take it, Ms. Kumar, you'd like to respond to this too. So I will just say quickly, law enforcement has been extraordinary, both in their efforts to combat the cartels and the supply, but also in understanding the seed of the demand and really urging us to do more treatment and recovery. So it's been a real partnership, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to them. Ms. Kumar, what did you want to say?
No, I just wanted to add that, Director McDaniels raised sort of very important issues, but one thing that we've noticed that a lot of these pill presses are coming in from China.
Yeah.
And so our recommendations on the value of the Corporate Transparency Act and beneficial ownership to be able to track who owns the company provides law enforcement and Director McDaniels the resources to not just have to look at this issue as just an arrest issue, but you can track the money, track the ownership, and then sort of use a targeted sanctions program if necessary.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. We also just have done public outreach to especially make sure teenagers understand that if they buy something on the dark web or on the street, that it may look like a legitimate prescription medication, but it may very likely not be. Professor Realio, I wanted to ask you a question. You noted in your testimony that fentanyl and fentanyl precursor chemicals are often manufactured in China and then shipped to Mexico. You've all talked about that. Mexican drug trafficking organizations then process the fentanyl and fentanyl precursors and smuggle them into the United States. And I've heard from my law enforcement how closely they're seeing that relationship too, even doing investigations from New England. As noted by Senator Grassley, in return, Mexican drug trafficking organizations often launder their money through Chinese networks by bank transfers, smuggled bulk cash, or even cryptocurrency. Professor, I know we've talked about this in this hearing, but what more can the United States and Congress do to disrupt the flow of cartel funds to China for money laundering? And then I'll turn to the rest of you if you have anything to add to the testimony you've already provided. Professor?
Sure. To echo, I think that all of our witnesses today have expressed, we are really fighting the question of how we can expand, in the case of the United States, our human and more importantly, financial, and thirdly, the technological resources that we need at FinCEN and through law enforcement and the plethora of other agencies who work in an interagency approach to actually go after the money and then go after the traffickers. These are large networks and they're so innovative. That's something that we saw during the pandemic, is how quickly they were able to adapt. This is the question then how the Mexican cartel started to produce to switch to producing was because of the interruption of the physical trade between China and Mexico. So this is where we're really coming up against the challenge of how do we keep up with the innovations of these TCOs? And then sadly too, they actually take advantage of all the physical wealth they have to avail themselves of new technologies and this conversion of, let's say, laboratories that used to be profiting and producing heroin from poppy to actually synthetic drugs that are more in demand and much more profitable and lower risk. They don't have to deal with issues like the cultivation of poppy in terms of floods or anything else. But this is why we have to actually devote more intelligence resources and law enforcement resources to go after this problem and address this in our bilateral engagement directly with China.
Thank you. And I'll ask any of the three physically in the room if you want to briefly add. Yes, Ms. Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. In the context of the China issue, one thing is also critical to remember is that a lot of the money movements that we are seeing and the use of sort of trade-based money laundering or black market peso exchange is because of currency controls that exist in the country. And the money laundering techniques are a direct result of those currency controls in the country. So ensuring that the US has perhaps a trade transparency unit relationship with China, which we don't currently have, as a way to exchange information, is another way to sort of target this work around currency controls in the country.
Excellent. And Director.
I also want this committee to, if you're not aware, the amazing amount of markup that the cartels are making on fentanyl and the push, what's going on. And a kilo right now in Houston, you can buy a kilo of fentanyl for $30,000. A kilo of fentanyl will actually equate to a million milligrams of fentanyl, and you can make 1 million tablets out of that and sell them anywhere from $6.50 to $65 in Houston, equating to a 6 million to a 37 million markup. And the pills that we're seizing in all across the country are usually containing somewhere between 1 milligram and 2 milligrams, more like 1.5, but anything over that is lethal. So just that's why the cartels, I've never seen something with a profit margin like fentanyl, and I don't see them slowing down at all.
It's high profit margin and very easy to smuggle, obviously, and those two things make it just a particularly attractive thing. I want to ask one more question. If Ms. Hanachek, I didn't know if you had anything to add to this discussion.
The only thing I'd add, Senator, is just to add to my colleague's comments about the importance of increasing collaboration. I will just note that as part of the Summit for Democracy, there will be a follow-on cohort led by the United States focusing on anti-money laundering issues. As we're looking forward to that 2.0 Summit for Democracy in December, I really would like to emphasize the importance that the United States increase resourcing not only to its own financial intelligence unit, FinCEN, but also collaborate with financial intelligence units in other countries to make sure that they have the appropriate resourcing that they need to tackle this problem.
Well, thank you. One last question. I'll start with the professor, please, and it's just about the dark web. It's increasingly become one of the dominant marketplaces for illicit drug sales to consumers. Drug sales are facilitated and anonymized on the dark web with payment in cryptocurrency and drugs delivered through the mail. I'm going to be introducing a bill soon with Senator Cornyn, which is aimed at combating drug sales on the dark web and strengthening the authority of the Joint Criminal Opioid Darknet Enforcement, or J-Code, to go after dark web marketplaces. What more can Congress do to combat the use of the dark web and other emerging technologies by drug trafficking organizations? And we'll start with you, Professor.
Sure. First, I applaud your initiative. It's super important, but also we actually have to start with educating our population. What happened during the pandemic, since everyone was online, all of these bad habits, and more importantly, the proliferation of the sale and marketing to our youth of promoting drug use and consumption, that's where we have seen many parents didn't know what their children were doing in their rooms or in the basement. And this is this question about how we have to educate, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. Every single generation is being affected by the opioid epidemic and these counterfeit pills. And this is where education is so important, and all of us can do this in terms of our own individual impact on our communities and in your constituencies. And we've seen too, not just by adding resources, but really advocating these public awareness campaigns, it's even more urgent than it was prior to the pandemic, as we've seen the mental health impact of COVID-19.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add before we close out? Well, with that, I thank you all so much for excellent testimony and very helpful testimony to all of us.